little bit about what we have been doing at the agency. It's been a little while since we've all gotten together, so I kind of wanted to take a few minutes to let you all know what we've been working on as it relates to this topic over the past few months. So Nina, I'm going to let you.
Sure, thank you. So as Erica mentioned, it has been a little bit since the task force last met to review the results of the Chimera research study. And following that meeting, the Department of Employment and Workforce facilitated 4 briefing sessions to present the results of the survey and research study to partners and stakeholders, including policymakers from the governor's office and the legislature. The briefing sessions were well attended, drawing more than 260 attendees to the live sessions and almost 60 views of the recording that's posted online at the task force website. The Q&A session at the end, session at the end of each of those briefing sessions covered a few common themes that ranged from wages to the effects of migration on labor force participation and the desire among many to dive deeper into labor force participation across demographic groups, including gender, race, veteran, and offender statuses. There continues to be a lot of interest around this topic. The agency, under Dr. Brian Grady's leadership, has created a labor force participation dashboard that allows users to see historical and current labor force participation data at the national, state, and county levels. We've continued to promote the task force and results of the research studies in presentations and discussions to our stakeholders and partners. We've also conducted some informal research on labor force participation activity in other states, which we'll speak about in just a few minutes, with a focus on states that have established a labor force participation goal. And so at this time, I will turn the discussion to Charles to provide a summary of some of the trending activity around education and workforce in our state and how that relates to labor force participation. Charles? And this slide just shows a screenshot of the labor force participation dashboard, which is on the task force website. We'll make sure to put a link of that in the chat so that you all can get to the dashboard very quickly. Use the mouse.
So again, great to be with y'all. I forgot to mention telling you about myself. I also have an amazing dog, Buddy, who is being trained to be a therapy dog. So for any of those of y'all who also have dogs, it's what keeps me happy on the times when I'm not at work. So anyway, what are we here to discuss today? Today, we are going to discuss the statewide Education and Workforce Development Act, which has passed the House and is currently sitting in the Senate. Slide. In understanding where it came from, when Representative Smith became Speaker Smith in May of last year, he said from the very start that economic development was going to be a key issue for him. Therefore, it really wasn't any surprise in September that Speaker Smith formed the House Economic Development and Utility Modernization Ad Hoc Committee, one of those fun committee names you can say 5 times fast and see what happens. What this is the bipartisan 12-member House panel that really had a great purpose. Slide. Speaker Smith was very intentional in ensuring that the committee included both new and seasoned members. Additionally, and including members that both represented rural and urban areas, as he knew workforce issues were ones that were across the state. So you have members from Boiling Springs, St. Matthews, Lake City, as well as Lancaster, Myrtle Beach, and Charleston. Slide. From September to January, the committee met for these several months. They received information, testimony from state agencies, industry associations, as well as individual businesses. Then in January 2023, the committee put forth a recommendation for the statewide Education and Workforce Development Act. And what this served as is its first of several steps in how to continue economic development success into the future for the state. So what are the 3 main purposes of this bill? First, it seeks to coordinate various workforce development services. The current law includes a council of agencies, but the new bill expands that list to include additional agencies and entities that were found to also be involved in education and workforce efforts. After studying agencies over the last year, I can tell you firsthand that these employees really work as hard as at any company and truly are passionate about what they do. What the coordination is going to enable is the opportunity to work smarter together rather than harder in silos. Because of this incredible talent across the agencies, I like to think of the council bringing together, what you'll see in parentheses, is the dream team of education and workforce players, just like our U.S. Olympic basketball dream teams of the past. One of the methods of coordinating these efforts is the creation of a unified state plan and metrics. Right now, you have the federal government requiring multiple state plans, including workforce, one for workforce, another for career and education technology. There's a state law that has a process for K through 12th grade related to career clusters and individual graduation plans. Lastly, each of the agencies in state government and those with education and workforce services have to submit an agency-specific plan at the state level. Currently, none of these plans are referencing one another nor providing continuity between the services and goals of each other. So what a unified plan is going to allow is flexibility in workforce programs so they can align their activities and fill in workforce system gaps rather than duplicating existing activities. The purpose is to synchronize, not replace existing plans. So these other plans will still exist, but what it is going to hopefully do is the unified one will kind of tie them all together. And having a unified plan, often a big question we get is, are agencies going to participate? Thankfully, during the House processes, representative heads of the 10 different agencies that I told you we were able to meet with, they all came together for the first time, and they all expressed a willingness for their agency to work together toward that plan. So we now have a group of willing entities. We have the process of we're going to create a plan and metrics, which is a great foundation. But what we were missing was accountability. And that kind of gets us to the next purpose in the bill, which you see is central oversight of these entities. The bill strives to achieve accountability through a single responsible office. While the coordinating council will be larger than it currently is, what the bill does is have a defined hierarchy of voting, coordination, and implementation with a new executive subcommittee or new executive committee and the Office of Statewide Workforce Development. Also, building upon some of the dashboards that are already created, accountability will be achieved through a dashboard that shows the unified plan and shows the metrics so that anyone from the public can see it, along with some reporting for the governor, Senate, and House leadership. And that public-facing aspect brings me to the last purpose of the bill, which is ensuring easy access to a customer-centric workforce system. One of the ways the bill seeks to make access easier is through creation of a single education workforce portal. Currently, if you look across the internet, there's a challenge of navigating the complex, confusing, tangled web of services because each different agency has multiple websites. For example, there are at least 4 different websites with information on career pathways. And a single portal, individuals, including students, parents, job seekers, business owners, and those who are making policy can access information and tools in that single place. And some of the tools that the bill is imagining is a supply gap analysis, a career pathway tool, and an education alignment tool. The supply gap analysis is going to include current and projected employer demands, growing industry and occupation clusters, supply of graduates by degree, trends in workforce and education pipeline. And as you all know, this is vital to decisions on training and investments in training. The education program alignment toolkit is going to provide information about what the workforce needs are in the state and region, kind of based on the supply gap analysis. It's then going to compare it to the initiatives and the programming that are currently in those education systems to determine if any changes are needed to make what is being taught align with what is being needed in the business area. Lastly, the career pathways tool is going to provide students, parents, job seekers, educators, and those school counselors who are working with the students information about routes from start to finish, what different certificates you need, credentials you need, along with schools that offer them, costs at each of the schools, as well as potential salary and benefit, so that individuals can really see, hey, what's the return I'm going to get in this investment that I'm making, both financially and with my time. So as you can tell, the between the current law and the expanded responsibilities in the new bill, what the General Assembly is really seeking to do is transform education and workforce in the state. But as I mentioned at the beginning, part of that foundation is in the transformation is establishment of a statewide plan and decisions on those metrics. One of the metrics included in the new bill is establishing a goal for the state's labor force participation rate, which I believe now brings us to the part where Dr. Grady is going to have some discussion with y'all so that we can kind of rely on the experts in helping the council create that goal.
All right, thank you, Charles. So, as he indicated, one of the provisions that would be assigned to the Coordinating Council on Workforce Development in this bill would be establishing a labor force participation rate goal, which obviously, when we read that and thought about this group, we're like, well, this seems like an obvious opportunity to pick the minds of people who are on this call. So what we did was a little bit of reconnaissance to figure out, okay, is anybody else doing this? And we actually found, yes, we found that 4 other southern states, you see them there on screen, had done some sort of work to identify a labor force participation goal and or a goal for producing more people with credentials that are valued in the workforce. So you can see here what the exact language, and these are taken from various state websites, either from the counterpart to do or the governor's office or something of that sort. So you see here, Alabama wants to add 500,000 credentialed Alabamians, catchy word, to the labor force, workforce recognized skills. North Carolina, you see there, they have a goal of 86% of their 25 to 44-year-olds participating in the labor force by the end of the decade. They also separately want there to be 2 million people with a valuable credential in that same age group at that same timeline. Oklahoma, you can see there, along with Tennessee, both looking to increase their labor force participation rate by 65%. Tennessee, I think, somewhat unrealistically looking to get up to that level in the next 2 years. So when we started reviewing the materials and in some cases reaching out to the people in these states, what we found is that these were not set with a methodology in mind. I don't want to say they were pulled out of a hat, but they were kind of pulled out of a hat. So there's not really a clear methodology behind them, which as a nerd sort of unnerves me. I'd like to have some sort of reason why we're setting the threshold where we set it. And you'll see here that there's at least 3 different approaches that are embodied in here. So you've got Oklahoma and Tennessee that are focusing on the official BLS labor force participation rate turned out by the feds. You've got Alabama, who's looking at the number of people with workforce credentials, whether that's a certificate up to graduate degrees. And you've got North Carolina, who is looking at a level of 25 to 44 is somewhat of an odd range. Usually you see 25 to 54 or 18 to 64, but they're looking squarely at this young to middle age group and their labor force participation, as well as their number of people with credentials. So you've got a wide variety of approaches, but as I said, none of them seem to be based on any sort of macroeconomic data or assumptions about labor growth. So one of the things we wanted to update is in the original white paper that Erica and I produced for the task force a little over a year ago, we had data on labor force by demographics. The Bureau of Labor Statistics puts these out once a year, so they've now updated these numbers with 2022 figures. This sort of feeds into the question that was raised by our reports, particularly the Chamorro analysis of what is the role that age plays in the state's low labor force participation rate. So you can see there for the annual average for 2022, South Carolina's number was 56.3%, which, as you can see, there was the 4th lowest in the country. The most recent reading back in February was at 55.9, which was the 3rd lowest in the country for that specific month. You'll see that, however, the 4 age ranges for which we have data for all 50 states, we are not as bad, not great, but not down at 4th lowest. You can see there across each of those 4 10-year slices, we're the bottom 10, but we're better off than that overall number would suggest. And on the right, you can see what the last 10 years has looked like month by month. But this sort of, again, raises the question of, how should we slice and dice these numbers? As mentioned, there's a lot of different ways we can do this demographically, either with official BLS data or potentially other data that may be available. So these next two charts are data from the Revenue and Fiscal Affairs Office, our sister agency here in South Carolina. This is just a chart they put together, which is based on census data. And it does highlight that, oddly, even though last year South Carolina was the third fastest growing state in the country by raw count, we actually had a natural decrease in population. There were more deaths than births. Certainly part of that is the effects of the COVID pandemic, but also the fact that South Carolina is continuing to get substantially older. So even though we are fast growing, that is a function of migration, to some extent international, but largely domestic, and not natural increase there. So some additional data from RFA. So this is looking at population growth and then looking at the percentage of that population that falls into the 1864 working age group. So as mentioned, South Carolina expected to continue growing at a pretty fast clip for the rest of the decade. But you see there that the share of the population that is within the 18 to 64 bracket is decreasing. So that was almost 63% in 2010, almost 60% in 2020. It is expected to be less than 58% by 2030. So this sort of sets up an open discussion. So we'd welcome participation from those on the call of what do we do here? So as I said, I'm sort of speaking out in favor of a methodology that would underlie a labor force participation goal that the coordinating council would set under the provisions of this bill. So the question would be, should it be an overall participation rate? Should it be a participation rate of particular age ranges or other demographic groups? Nina mentioned up front, there was a lot of concern about what does this look like for different groups, such as people who are in the reentry population and others. So you've got a lot of issues there. Two, sort of what should we feed into the model? So we've got all this data on migration, aging, fertility. So you've got that sort of, sets up the number of people who could potentially be in the denominator of whatever target we set. Are there economic trends that need to be taken into account? Certainly we have expectations of businesses that we expect to come to the state through incentive packages and such. What assumptions should we make about how the overall economy is going to operate moving forward? And also, what sort of range should we be talking about? Should we be looking at a very short-term goal, or should we be looking at a 10, 15, 20-year goal for participation? And then there's sort of the numbers question of the nitty gritty. So as I mentioned, we have the month-by-month statewide participation rate that is produced by BLS in conjunction with my team in LMI here at Duke. We have subgroup data on an annual basis. There are also private entities that offer, that sell data on labor force participation that are sliced and diced at a finer grain than is available in official information. We mentioned the labor force participation dashboard earlier, which again is on the task force website, du.sc.gov/taskforce. And that builds upon an approach from Tennessee where basically you only have that participation rate at the state level because the Census Bureau does not estimate its civilian non-institutional population, which is the denominator of the rate, below the state level. But we can use other data sources like the American Community Survey to estimate it. So we've done that for counties, and on a very experimental basis, the cities that are large enough to have data, there are 21 cities of 25,000 or more. So we have labor force data from those municipalities. Again, sort of a question of what should we put on the table? What data is most or least useful? So we're kind of throwing out to the group. So I see we've already got some hands raised in the room. So go ahead and start with Laura.
Okay, so I had an issue with my phone and I had to restart my phone. So I have one question for you before I formulate my full response. Is this a requirement to have this goal? Is part of the bill require a goal?
Yes.
It requires a
Okay.
goal for labor force participation as well as a goal for credential attainment.
Okay. So I think some of you guys know, but not all of you, that I'm the economist for North and South Carolina for the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond. And so I'm very familiar with North Carolina's goal, and they are not going to reach it, in my opinion. They're already pretty far behind, and it's not going to happen. And they stood up a whole office that this is what they've been doing, right? They have an awesome director who's one of the best people in the state, but because of the demographics, because of what happened with COVID, like they're not going to hit this goal. And it's going to be terrible when they don't hit it, because they've spent so much money trying to hit this goal. So I, in general, just think this is not a good idea. But if you have to do it, you have to do it. So here's the question I have, Brian, about the model. What if the model tells you that labor force participation rate's actually going to decline, and so your goal is for it to go down, but not down as far as?
No, I had thought of that. Yeah, we would certainly expect from the
I think
demographic.
there's either limiting. Yeah, I'm even thinking if you limit it by demographics. And the reason I'm saying that is because even if you limit it by working age or things like that, like if you look right now nationally, that 20 to 24 age group is the one that's really lagging in addition to the over age 65. I'm just not convinced necessarily that even looking at working age population, if you built a model, that it would tell you that we're going to see growth. I could be wrong. I'm just saying I think there's a probability that it shows negative growth.
I think that's. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I think part of this is like the discussion about policy, right? Like under current policy, something could change. Like I'm saying, North Carolina is not going to hit their target, but if the Pell Grant's expanded tomorrow, maybe they do, right? Like there's things that could happen that could really change that. But under current policy expectations, this makes me very nervous. I don't, like, if I were you guys, I would not want this thing. I'm just being very honest. But if you absolutely had to do it, I would limit it to the group, whether it's prime age, or it may be that these other states have limited it even beyond, to 45 for this reason. Like they're trying to limit it even to younger groups of people to try to get a higher number. I'm not sure, but
the law does not say that it has to be the official BLS labor force, though.
No,
We can choose.
So if there's another method of we can define labor force participation however we want to.
right. And so I would say that yes, I mean exactly the concern that you raised, Laura, is something I had thought of, that no policy is gonna change demographics to that extent.
right.
But
Ron has his hand raised. Do we want to?
yeah, I'll cut to Ron in a second. So the one idea I wanted to throw out here as that just kind of came to me as we thought about this is, we could set a goal relative to other states. It could be we want our ranking to go up to such and such, which would obviate the need to say we're going to hit a specific number that the underlying population data does not justify. So that's something to throw out there to the group. Yeah, Ron, if you want to go ahead.
Oh, he's got to think about it.
Working on unmuting.
So while Ron's unmuting, I will say this is like yay, Ron, we made it.
All right, I moved it to the other screen so I could look at a data point, and then couldn't find it on the other screen. All right, so many things. Okay, first off, if we look at kind of, I get nervous about targeting labor force participation rates and not targeting labor force growth. The primary reason is that we are getting, if we were to look at like 24-year-olds, for example, we had significant population adjustments in the past 2 years. All of the labor force growth that's occurring is coming from Hispanic. So this is migration. So the federal government's trying to basically boost the amount of workers by basically bringing in a very specific young migrant population. And I think that that is, you know, in all the writings that I've been doing, that's kind of the thing that I've been driving, is that there's a way of achieving this kind of working population growth to satisfy the needs of the population you have. So let's cover a couple of things. So that first off, as you kind of discussed, South Carolina's over 65 population, a couple of percentage points higher than the national average. A lot of those people who are there aren't the fact that they're just over 65, but a lot of them have chosen to retire to the state. So it's a kind of the double whammy. They are coming from other places with the intent of not working. So it's different than just having a population that gets older in a certain area and they maybe continue to work because they've had a business there and they'll just continue to operate that and maybe until their 70s. So you do have a population that, you know, I've mentioned this before in our calls, that will be requiring services and the like. And I think it's going to be very hard to say, well, we want to not have those people come in because we're trying to boost our labor force participation rate, and those people hurt that boosting. The way you kind of overcome that would really be like, well, one of two things. One, you try to attract a net migration of a targeted younger population into the state. And if you know the state's immediately around you, that's going to be really difficult. And then the second part would be a targeted path on immigration. So if you may be aware that the governors of Indiana and Utah had sent a letter to Congress saying, can you please just give states the right to immigrate to the amount that we want and no more federal oversight. Just let us do the amounts. And I think that is the beginning of a conversation to say that that is part of a strategy, because you don't target immigrants to bring them in to retire in your area and to spend money. You're bringing them in to create GDP, to create products. So I think that this is the problem that I have, is when you put a labor, and I saw that with those other states, I'm like, targeting a labor force participation goal when you have an aging population is a battle for young people that you're probably, it's just going to be a net. You lose a person, you gain a person. I would be more concerned on meeting the needs of the industries that are going to be servicing the population through whatever means necessary, whether that be, like I said, targeting an immigrant population of a certain count, or, you know, targeting certain schools, certain people to come in and serve the needs of certain industries that you have. So just wanted to throw a couple of those things in there.
Yeah, I would also, agree on the net migration standpoint of targeting that. I'm on the coordinating council for workforce development, so we're going to be having to be held to the standard of putting some number out there, but focusing on the outcome needs of driving the business needs as well as the net migration. And I would target the 25 to 44 for that. And then what we lose in the throughput from education is the number of students that come out of high school, 16 to 24, that are not tied into the economy. And so in that workforce bill, it's really tied into what do we do with our career centers? What do we do with our K-12 education to set that standard? Because I think we have to get or attract individuals as net migration in that ability. They've already gained their education outcome, but then what we need to look is a throughput from our current K-12 structure and really target that for future growth. I think the demographics are going to be too heavy on the individual retirees coming to South Carolina because that's the current model, and we don't want to turn those folks away. But where we can really tighten up that advertisement to build in those areas and also fulfilling those workforce needs. I mean, just in Spartanburg County, we've had over $3 billion in announcements, and every night I go to bed knowing that we have 4,500 jobs to fill. And I can't meet that need when I've already done the demographic analysis of our students that graduate from high school. In Spartanburg, Cherokee, and Union, there's about 3,000 students that have no training, no intent to go to the military, no pathway into a career. And so we're trying to absorb that by building in new track methods with individuals like BMW to upphase their training and put them in a role where they're not going into higher education. They're just doing it in the certification to build in the OSHA training and that kind of stuff. So if we don't tackle that need, then we can't grow our workforce. I do know and I do understand that if we target those rates on the margin and give something to set a platform, I do like your idea, Brian, of saying we move ourselves incrementally up, but eventually somebody's going to come and say, well, it's a law. It says we have to put in a number. And so I think we're going to have to fight that challenge. But I think the focus is well put with what, has been stated before me, but with Laura and with Ron, from my standpoint, but tying it in that throughput as well with the education and with the K-12 system is going to be critical to tighten up that gap.
So here's a question. If they want, and of course, some of the, I think, elected officials that have thrown this goal into the bill because this is a very big buzzword and every news station you turn on is labor force participation rate. Is there a way that and it is still in the Senate, so it could be amended. Can you all think of a way in which to word it so that it may satisfy the buzzworthiness, but not tie the CCWD's hands in having something that's unfeasible?
So when you think about
So
total,
can I?
Oh,
Go ahead. Go
sorry.
ahead.
I was gonna say, when you think about total population growth, if you were to grow the population at a younger rate, totality, at the same time that you're losing total labor force labor force participation rate, you would have an influx of what is the supply meets demand in the economy. So I think we should target what jobs are open and how we're filling those jobs and what the status is for that versus just a rate for labor force participation. That would be not my suggestion. Because if we don't fill the jobs, how can we go out and recruit more scouts or anything back to South Carolina? So it's more supply and demand versus, just the rate. But that's my thought.
Yeah. Frank's had his hand raised for a good long while, so I want to call on him and bring him into the conversation.
Thanks. Sorry, I put a, now you can see me. I don't know if that's a good thing. But anyway, a couple of comments. Some have already been made. So, but I agree with Lord in that it would not be a good idea to put a specific number because that's one issue. And for all the reasons she said, I'm also not excited about talking about moving up the rankings because part of this discussion, I'm looking at the labor force participation rate and the result of all the survey material we got. I'm trying to think, well, what policy put them into being out of the labor force? I don't see that there was a policy that did that. So I'm not too sure what policy could bring them back into the labor force. Now, I agree 100% with the training aspects that is brought up in, Spartanburg. I mean, that's yes, but that's not what this legislation is focusing on, unfortunately. The better pipeline from schools, perfect. That's exactly what a good training system would do, and is the traditional sort of goal of this office. And in fact, as the Employment Security Commission was in finding employment. So I think that's hands down. That is certainly what needs to be done. The focus on getting a better number for labor force participation rate, I don't quite get, and so. I have a problem with that because too much of what drives that is outside of our control. Mm-hmm. And then, so what do you do now? It's kind of like me saying, at the end, I've got exams coming up next week. I can get, my target is at 100% get A's. Well, I don't control that so well, unless I jury rig the numbers. And that's been sort of proposed, that we jury rig the numbers so that we hit the target rate. And I'm not excited about that as a possibility either. When you set these kinds of targets, it's not like me shooting to lose 5 pounds. That's within my control. I can do something about it. There's mechanisms and everything else, but that scares me about some of the things we're talking about right now.
Yeah, my comment that I was going to make too, following up, was similar to Frank's that he just made about policy. Like, I'm a little confused. The bill, what does it stand up in addition to this? Like North Carolina, when they set their goal, they have the My Future NC office. They have Cecilia Holden, who is a power broker within the state running it. They are heavily focused on what policies are going to get them there. It doesn't sound like that's what's happening here. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I missed that while my phone was off. But if not, under current policy, we wouldn't expect this to probably change, just given everything. I mean, given the current state, like what would make people come back into the market? And so if there is a target and we don't hit it, then whose fault is it? Is it the people's fault? Is it y'all's fault? Is it where does the responsibility lie to hit that target?
So I think their thought in the bill is, so it would set up a central office. The Office of Statewide Workforce Development would be kind of the central point that would bring together, and it also includes some other various aspects I didn't kind of go through, one of which is having a consolidated workforce budget. And so all of the various ways that money is being spent on education workforce efforts through the agencies, pass-throughs to other entities, basically it would all be brought together in a single budget so that the policymakers could go, all right, where are we spending our workforce dollars and our education dollars? And where are there any overlaps within those? And then it would kind of be up to the CCWD to make recommendations through the agencies and going, all right, let's focus on our strengths and let's cut where we're duplicating over things so that we can be more effective overall in what's going on. Because right now there's no single place you can go to that goes, hey, here are all the workforce and education programs in the state, and here's all the dollars that are flowing to them, whether it's interviewing skills or resumes or soft skills or getting them credentials. There's nowhere to see that in one place. So that's what the bill is kind of standing up, is the ability to see where all the assets currently are and the expenses are, and then make, I think, policy decisions based on being able to see all of that, and then what is working and what's not working.
Okay.
Laura, I will go ahead and ask you, do you think my characterization of North Carolina was accurate? Because I did speak to them and they were not able to articulate a reason why they said 86% of people 25 to 44. Do you have any insight on that?
I do not have any insight on that, but I think a lot, to your point about methodology, a lot of this is political, right? And so even that my future NC goal, it's a nice round number. Why that number, right? Because it sounded good politically. And so I think it's just, I'm just watching in North Carolina. They're doing a lot of good stuff. And by the way, their legislature invests a lot more heavily in education than ours does. Like, it's not that they're not spending money. It's not that they're not trying. It's that they have these demographic trends that South Carolina has as well. And on top of that, we can see that, as Michael mentioned, like, there are more disengaged youth, enrollment's going down overall nationally. Like, these trends are moving against them, and it's not that they are doing anything wrong. I don't think it's just going to be, as of right now, I think impossible for them to hit that goal. And then it's going to be this huge failure. And I don't know,
That's great information to have right now, because it does allow, like I said, the bill has not passed yet. So there is time to at least inform the policymakers. Here's things going on in other states. Here's what some of the experts, again, y'all on this line, are saying maybe more feasible ones. I 100% love the comments about making sure that whatever it is something we can control. And it's not just kind of left up to chance here. And so I love the goal of the percent of jobs open. If that was something that was being pitched to policymakers, is there someone we could flesh that out and going, hey, here's how we control this, here's some potential negatives to it, or there are other ones that we could push to? Because it's easy to go to them and go, listen, we could have this arbitrary number and be like North Carolina, who's about to fail on it, and we definitely don't want to do that. And they're going to go, well, what alternatives do we have? And so being able to flesh out this one that was just proposed, or other ones, may give at least an opportunity for the policymakers to have that more information when they're considering whether they want to amend the bill any. Because they overall all want to improve workforce here, but they want to do it in reasonable ways too.
Well, I think investing in some of the not only the trainings, but the upskilling and then recruiting entities or individuals from other states for certain types of jobs. I mean, I think it was 4 years ago, I was sitting in a president's council meeting for the state, and we're talking about 75,000 jobs open in the state, but yet we didn't have the skill sets to fill them. So the focusing on the net migration, as well as, upskilling those individuals in the marketplace to meet those demands. The big cause there is not political. The big issue there is not having enough workforce to recruit any more industries to the state for an investment. So that's very real. And so we can get into discussions about, labor force participation, rate. But at the end of the day, if we don't have employees or individuals with the skills to bring other companies to the state, I think that's where we really, double down on. And that can be, something that measures, and that Department of Employment Workforce measures showcases, and then we have to have targeted, specific, tactical, training outcomes to say this is what we're going to incentivize, or these are what areas we're going to double down on. And I mean, we're doing that at a scale, to some level with, say, BMW and the EV training and the technologies, that we're doing there. But that's a whole different investment when you start to look at, new economies are meeting those goals. So also controlling for those specific areas. So what are those main areas? I mean, we know across the board there'll be a lack of supply in some areas of the economy, and that's across the board in certain areas. But what are those huge areas that we can really target? And that can be, I've seen great data come out after having served on the state, workforce development board for many years, showing these are targeted areas of these niches. But then how are we attacking that? And I think that's where the state could really put not just policy, but investment in those arenas to say we're going to double down in those specific areas versus targeting kind of a generalized, rate that could be very hard to hit. And the outcome of that would be political as well, too, because then you set a goal up and then you try to hit it and then it doesn't come through. And, let's learn from North Carolina, but it's also, let's try to meet the job needs and the demand. So then then Department of Commerce can go back and sell it and say, well, now we have other, opportunities to bring more companies in these other areas. And I'd say also diversification of those jobs. I'm working very diligently on some new realms, and specifically in some advanced microelectronics and some other areas, because the CHIPS Act and stuff like that, because it's an open opportunity of doing some more onshoring or reshoring. And so, are we even investing, in that kind of education? We are, but we're doing that at a very small chunk versus what could be potentially done at a state level. So.
I don't know why you're looking at me.
We have so I really appreciate all of the feedback. I think that was kind of, something that we were tossing around at the beginning was, is the goal. I mean, right now the legislation has that in there, setting it, but I think understanding and maybe being able to present data that, if only 59% of our population is even within the traditional working age, perhaps picking 65% out of a hat, like the two other states that Brian mentioned, is maybe not the best option. So, if we are forced to pick a number, let's pick one that, makes sense, even if it's, okay, we want to maintain 55% labor force participation. So, really appreciate the feedback there. But it sounds like we have some options and we can work with Charles and our other people that do stuff with the General Assembly to maybe affect that piece of the bill more so than some of the others.
Erica, can I say one more thing about that I was
Absolutely.
just sitting here thinking about?
Please.
So the labor force participation rate data comes out of the household survey, right? Something Michael said made me think about this. So do we really care about what percentage of people who live in South Carolina are working or looking for work, or do we care about how many employees establishments in South Carolina have? If we're able, I mean, we've got two border states, right, where we can, in some markets, especially where I live up in York County, we, in theory, import some talent from North Carolina. You could do the same from Georgia. You could have remote workers that come in from other places. Like, is thinking about data that's in the establishment survey better than thinking about data that are in the household survey? I don't know the answer to that, but
For face-to-face jobs, you need people there. I think the crisis is satisfying the needs of a tourism industry, of a retirement community that needs fed, or nursing homes.
Right.
Those are things that, yeah, you definitely care. I get what you're saying, and I think this was the point that Michael was making earlier, is that, look, we need to satisfy the needs of the businesses out here. Great, that's an approach that you want to take. But to get through that, you have a population that you're going to be pulling people from. And a lot of these jobs, I mean, I know South Carolina enough to know that you're talking about a lot of services jobs. So, I mean, we got to be honest about those people drive 15 minutes to, 25 minutes max, and they need to be there and they need to be participating.
Yeah, no, I think that's a fair point. And yes, I'm not going to go through the entire methodology of how the participation rate is calculated, but yes, it is ultimately based in large measure on the household survey. And I think there are two separate questions. And I think part of it is a function of the way that state government is organized. You have the Department of Commerce that is there to attract businesses to the state of South Carolina. And then you have our agency's mandate, which is to ensure that the workers who live in the state are properly trained and have resources and are able to find employment. So there's sort of a semi-natural division of labor there that might be driving the thought process.
Yeah, makes sense.
And going on the thought of ensuring that the percentage of jobs open and targeting, making sure the businesses get what they need. In terms of a goal for credentials, is it, I mean, there is a theory that the more people learn, the more credentials they have, the more opportunities they have in workforce. Is that enough in a general sense that we don't care, hey, whatever credentials you get, as long as people are getting credentials, or do we want that to be targeted as well and say we want to ensure people have credentials in areas that are going to need jobs? Because there's a general theory that the more learning you get, you'll be better overall and gaining additional skills.
They have to be, at least in North Carolina, they have to be industry recognized credentials. So in theory, at least, they're credentials that are tied to employment, in theory.
Can they be in any industry, or do they have to be in the ones that you're? And the reason I ask this is because there's an onslaught of, well, there hasn't been yet. There's growing one. I have a feeling it's going to get only bigger, of companies coming out going, we can provide these credentials, we can provide these credentials, we can provide this, that, and the other. And so does it become, I get a piece of paper, I got a credential, so I can meet an overall goal of the state having X number of credentials, or is it actually something moving us forward?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. There are definitions around what constitutes an industry recognized credential. But to your point, they're not perfect. And there are certainly credentials out there that are not pathways to higher paying jobs. So I think that remains an issue, just in kind of education in general.
Yeah, I think that's something also to take a look at from a policy standpoint with LLR. And then, the state's ability, we've talked about that in previous meetings, where if someone's coming in from out of state, sometimes the licensure or the credential doesn't match up. And so how do we tie that into a way to take this net migration and encourage folks to come to South Carolina? So that's a policy discussion. And then I do agree that a lot of these service fields, we've jointly tied into students where they continue to get their degree while they're working for the company. Or their credential. And so they're in the labor force, they're getting a job, but then when they get that credential, they get bumped up, or they get, awarded or rewarded for going into that area. So there's a whole plan and purpose for doing that. And the companies in some industries won't hire them, or won't, in some, like healthcare, I was at Palmetto Patriots home yesterday because we just signed an LPN agreement where we're going to be growing those LPN nurses, and they may have a CNA, they might have some kind of qualification, but we're working with them to build that capacity for that talent, and that's critical, because it's like Ron was saying, those service area jobs, both in tourism and also in, just think of the healthcare needs in our state. I mean, are hugely important to just servicing, the total population, everything from EMTs to, nursing homes to wherever it might be, and so. And those have pretty distinct, in some areas, they have pretty distinct, qualifications and credentialing that have to be, formatted. I would just say that sometimes, for instance, just a reference, but my barber is a aging individual, and he's older, a lot older than I am, and he had a friend that wanted to come from West Virginia to open up barbering. The guy had been cutting hair for 30 years. And he couldn't come to South Carolina because he would have had to go through a whole another process in order to do that. And so, and he wasn't willing to do that. And he was married to a South Carolinian. They were going to move here, and he couldn't do it because there was too many barriers to entry into that particular field. And I was like, man, it's like, who am I going to get to cut my hair one day?
Hey, by the way, on this subject, the federal government, I think state governments, you can track apprenticeships. So you could do things where you're targeting certain credentials. So certain apprenticeships and certain skilled trades, because we know we need skilled trades, especially if you want to build any facilities. And then obviously nursing degrees, things like that can all be tracked. But the danger in this is where we're going to keep going back to, and that's a net gain. So as you say, I want to increase credentials, or I want to increase apprenticeships, or I want to increase LPN enrollments, what you're saying is that I'm going to rob from my college enrollment. The only way I make that up is then I'm going to have my colleges like South Carolina does. I live in Florida. You come down here and target a lot of Floridians to come up there, versus the opposite of what the gentleman in the room was saying. But yeah, I think that this is the thing you always have to remember is anytime you start to put numbers on things, understand the law of unintended consequences. So I'm going to drive things into skilled trades, and then all of a sudden my people saying, well, where are my college graduates? Well, the state started financially incentivizing people to go down this route, and so they went down this route. So this is a tricky game, and it's not going to get better. It's going to continue to kind of get worse and worse. That's why I was saying earlier about, I just highly encourage you to take a very strategic approach to immigration, just because you're going to have to figure out how to add bodies that are productive bodies. And I think that is an easier thing to have a oversight on, to put controls around, to target and say, we brought in X number and they went and were distributed into these particular roles. That is a lot easier game than saying I have a net population and I'm going to start divvying it up based on critical need. Okay, critical need now, next year, 5 years. Wait, I mean, I did something this year and that really caused my car to start veering off the road, and in 3 years it's going to crash. So this is the kind of the nature of the game. It's just you have to make sure you take in to a consideration, if we incentivize one thing or if we drive one thing, it is going to pull from others.
All right, well, I know we are running short on time, so I don't want to hold you all too long, but I did want to say thank you so much to all of you. I know I probably cold called a lot of you in December of 2021. Weren't really sure what this was all going to entail. I think we've done some really good work so far. I think we've learned a lot. I don't know about you all, but I especially was very intrigued by the survey responses that we got during our stuff. So at this point, we don't have any future plans for this phase of the task force, but we do know that this is not a problem that we have in any way solved, that we have added information to the discussion, and we know it's going to continue. Obviously, we have this workforce bill that's highly relevant to this topic. And then we also have the research that we've done over the past year that we want to kind of further explore on ways that we can nibble around the edges of policy and figuring out ways to bring people back in who may be able to be affected. So I'm going to let Nina kind of wrap us up and tell about next steps. But at this point, I would just again say how much I appreciated all of your willingness to participate in these last 6 meetings over the past year. And obviously, if you want to stay involved and updated on things, we are happy to have you. We love being able to pick your brains. So, don't feel like you have to go anywhere, but also don't feel like you need to come, just to other things if you're not interested in those topics. But obviously, you're always welcome to be as involved as you want to be going forward. So Nina, I'm going to turn it over to you to close us out.
Thank you. Well, this has been such a fruitful discussion. What I anticipated saying in closing remarks was how we were going to move forward with addressing some of the barriers that were identified in the labor force participation survey, specifically transportation, and adding to that childcare because of the emphasis of the workforce bill that we've talked about. I think you've given a lot for us to consider today in terms of next steps and whether even focusing on addressing the transportation barrier is going to be meaningful enough to make an impact on labor force participation. But the way we envision moving forward is that we will address some of these barriers through smaller working groups that invite subject matter experts to the table to weigh in more programmatically on existing efforts or activities that are currently taking place that it may need to be scaled, where there may need to be additional funding added to it to increase the relevancy of that statewide. To work to develop new efforts or activities, to further explore policy recommendations. And again, you've given us a lot to think about today, and to identify any existing funding or the need for additional funding to implement some of these. Internally, we've been talking a lot about this notion of migration and marketing South Carolina as a place to sort of live and work, and drawing folks from outside of South Carolina's borders into the workforce. And so we're internally discussing a good jobs or a great jobs campaign where we can really highlight all of the wonderful jobs and work opportunities that there are in our state, and encouraging individuals, from our neighboring states to come live in South Carolina and take one of the really great jobs that's here. We're also exploring the need for a more formal research network to guide the policy and development on this issue. And I think the nature of this conversation, which has been so rich, really underscores the need and the value in having a network of individuals such as yourselves to really contribute to this discussion as we move forward. And I just want to echo in closing, as Erica mentioned, just how much we appreciate your attendance at the meetings and the discussion, all of the recommendations that you've made. And certainly if you're interested in participating in any of the work groups as we move forward that are specific to addressing some of these barriers or developing the Good Jobs campaign, please just shoot us an email. We'd love to have your voice and your input in that discussion. And if there's no other business, we'll adjourn the meeting for today.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks to you guys.